Yes.
All right, I can, yeah.
It just got started. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming to our first enhancement subgroup meeting. I'm really excited for us to finally kick this off. It's been a long time coming, and I'm even more excited to see what work we get done as a subgroup on a whole. So I hope everyone has access to this document. It's in the link for the calendar invite. And for now, this is where we'll be tracking our meeting notes. We also have like the original proposal for the subgroup in this doc as well. But to get started, this is the agenda that we have for today. And I hope that everyone had a time or had a chance to like review our proposal that we presented a couple months back to the community and the TOC. We got approval, well, I should say tentative approval for the subgroup in July, where the TOC is pretty much given us a couple iterations where we as a subgroup should prove our value to the TOC and the community before we establish it as like a long-standing process / group in Istio. And today's meeting will be us going over like why we want to exist, as well as like help figure out what our first milestone and how we will prove that value to the TOC, like what we can really do there. So I can jump into this agenda now. And the first item is around operations. So at a high level, this group is designed to routinely like review all features in Istio, raise awareness across different features based on like, hey, these are features that Istio is supporting, as well as like driving and incentivizing action to keep all features like in the best hygiene possible. So that can look like making sure there's like graduation momentum, making sure all criteria is met for each feature and its feature stage. And most importantly, we want to create structure. So going back to how we provide value to the TOC, I ideally want this subgroup to become redundant, where as we go through these like different processes of like reviewing the features and so on, we are really creating processes and checks and balances where the subgroup doesn't need to exist anymore, and the TOC and the community is incentivized to add features and promote features accordingly without anyone needing to like actively do this review. So with that said, I have heard several anecdotes around when folks first attempted to add features to Istio, they had no idea what to do or how to like promote those features. And we want to remove all of those ambiguity and ideally model the way that Kubernetes or even the Gateway API do the enhancements process. Sorry about that. That's my dog. Give me 1 second. That was the mailman dropping off something, so my dog is trying to act all aggressive. Okay, so going back to where I was. So in the operations as a group, we want to figure out what is our frequency. For instance, like if we align to a specific release cycle, we want to have a clearly defined like milestone around in this cycle that we are iterating over these steps. What is our milestone, or what is like our success, our definition of done? And when I say iterating, I mean like each time we do a sprint or however you want to call the cycle, we want to identify like a subset of Istio features in which we want to actively review and update and present that current state of features to the TOC and the community, where we are raising awareness around what's going on with this feature. Is it at risk of deprecation? Is it time to graduate it? Like, are there any work that needs to be triaged and evangelized so that community members can pick up and move it along? And as we are doing this, we also want to retrospect and update any processes / structure that we have already created or create new ones. And at the end of that cycle, we can say we have officially delivered on our milestone / cycle and we want to repeat this again with a subset of next features. We don't know how much features we want to do in a given cycle as yet. It will be dictated based on the discussions we'll have in the future. But we want to keep in mind that we want to ensure that we can get those features completed entirely, as well as let's be aware of what is our capacity and what is needed to actually get these features across the finish line. Any questions so far? Cool. Okay. So another key highlights here is that right now this subgroup has 2 leads, myself and Facilio. Facilio is currently in Germany, so thanks for joining this call so late in your day. But we wanted to highlight what you can expect out of us, which is in any meeting that we have, at least one of us will attempt to attend the meeting and lead the meeting. Also, we will be the spokesperson to evangelize the work with the TOC and the larger community. And of course, as members, you all can volunteer to step in here as well. But we're taking on that responsibility for now. There's a lot of operational stuff that needs to happen in the background that we will constantly be on top of and execute on to ensure the subgroup stays recognized and on track in the community. And then we also want to provide clarity around what is it we're working on right now, what is our current milestone, so that we can give you all clarity on what work you can pick up to help with our milestone, as well as to even bring in others in the community to work on different stuff. I see that the work that we do can also be really good, first issues for new contributors in the community and so on. And we just want to make sure that it's very clear what we're sprinting towards and create very clear work that anyone can pick up. And of course, manage that work. Right now, we have a project board in the enhancements repo that we will be using to track whatever work that we do in the subgroup across the different features. And then, of course, there's everyone, which is the members of the group. Everyone is open to contribute. Ideally, we want our members to have opinions, actively review any PLs that's in the enhancement repo, propose and do work that will get the subgroup closer to accomplishing their current milestone. And we don't want to make anyone feel like if they are locked into the subgroup. So it's based on it's completely volunteer based. And we appreciate any assistance you give, and most importantly, any opinion that you share to help the work that we do really impact Istio in a long-term way. And then, of course, our next partner is the TOC. What we are doing will not truly be long-lasting unless we develop this relationship and expectation for the TOC, where we want the TOC to continuously acknowledge the effort that we are putting in. You want the TOC to delegate the authority to us to implement processes, take action accordingly. That is, of course, approved by the TOC, but we are just the persons who are executing on it or proposing it. To ensure that until we can make the subgroup redundant, we have asked the TOC to commit at least one person to lead this subgroup for the duration of the subgroup. Right now, that person is Facila and myself. But let's say if there's ever a time where no community member is willing to volunteer to lead the subgroup, we ideally expect the TOC to step in and keep it going. And of course, we need the TOC to be available for approval, feedback on proposed process changes, and different things that we highlight with the features that we have reviewed. Any questions or comments there? And of course, you can feel free to add to the doc afterwards as comments. Cool. So I think that's, for the most part, that's just housekeeping stuff. And now we can get into the reason we're all here, which is us all brainstorming around how do we actually show value to the TOC. I am really curious to hear everyone's opinion around what do you all think the TOC needs right now with respect to like features, feature review? And the outcome of this brainstorm will be us having at least 1 to 3 clear sentences for how us as a subgroup can show value to the TOC. And I can give everyone like a minute or two to think about, like, I guess not necessarily a mission statement, but like a clear one sentence around like why is the enhancement subgroup important to Istio and the TOC. And if you're ready, feel free to raise your hand and you can come off mute and share with the group. I'm hoping we can have some active discussions here. Does anyone have any thoughts? Hey, yes, Justin.
I guess more of a question. I could see this going in a couple directions. One would be sort of more backwards facing and figuring out, cleaning up our existing story around what the feature status of the existing features are. And another one would be more forward looking, trying to not repeat the same mistakes and providing guidance to new features and like new approaches to things like ambient, and not falling into not making the same mistakes. Do you have thoughts about which you want to do, if it's both, and like, and how we kind of contain that so it doesn't become just too large and too difficult to get agreement on?
Yeah, that's a great distinction you brought up, because I think any past effort that was done around the enhancements repo was a lot of like backfilling, and it was not completed, and I guess it sort of demoralized the team that was doing that. I think we can strive for balance, and I'm hoping that if we set up our sprint cycles such that, let's say, every feature in Istio is hit in every 3 milestones or so, I hope we can get to the point where we are able to clean up existing stuff, as well as ensuring that any new things that are added is falling in line what we have done in the past as we were like cleaning up the stuff. Or maybe as we are designing our milestone, we should maybe put a section for new stuff, like allot time for that specifically. And for instance, let's say 30% of our time goes to new and 70% goes to like clean up existing. What are your thoughts? Does anyone else have an opinion here?
Oh, sorry, I thought I didn't realize this. I had muted myself. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And sort of doing it on a release by release basis, taking individual components, I think that's a great way to do it. Coming up with suggestions would be good. And I think also having members of this group attend things like the ambient meeting and making sure that the new things that we're designing are not going in the wrong direction. Because there's been a couple of times there've been some conversations that started to go towards, oh, we can do this and clean it up later. And it, let's not do that again. Because it's much more difficult to do that than it seems in the moment.
Yeah, that's a great call out, because I've been hearing those comments too in our combined working group and ambient. Does anyone else have any thoughts around what else can potentially be our value? From what Justin suggested, I'm taking away the fact that we are cleaning up the mess that may exist in Istio right now, and getting it to the point where we all agree it should be too, as well as like ensuring that future stuff doesn't get to that point. Ethan, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I think there'd be a lot of value just in clarifying what the status of everything is, honestly. So, I mean, trying to push things forward is a great goal, and we should aim for that. But just having a sense of where everything is currently on its own would improve the situation, I think, quite a bit.
I agree with that, Ethan, but could you just expand a little bit on what's missing? Like currently there is definition, there's supposed to be. Is that not accurate? Is it not detailed enough? Just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I don't really know what the problem. I'm kind of colored by some internal discussions around like mesh config, for example.
Right.
At least internally at Google, there's debate among our engineers whether mesh config is experimental or GA. Obviously, individual features are clearly considered experimental, but so I meant that, and then I suspect most features have a clear like beta experimental GA status, but it still would be useful to know, like, are those features making, like, is someone working on them, right? So WASM being a good example, I think is kind of in this semi-permanent experimental state. You know, communicating that so people can kind of make decisions about incorporating certain features based on whether they're actually likely to progress would be useful.
Yeah, that makes sense. There is the the feature status, but maybe it's too coarse grained, and I don't, from a quick look, I don't see mesh config even there. So
Yeah,
okay.
and on that point, I think we need some clarity around what a feature is. And like, for instance, mesh config has like levels to it. There are features within mesh config. So I don't know if we should do some work there on like what exactly is a feature in Istio and how do you get more granular within that feature. Because there have been several discussions around promoting part of ambient or part of telemetry API to beta while leaving the rest where it currently is.
Right, yeah, because like this may not be the correct granularity, because like mesh config, as you mentioned, has sort of different sections, and sort of saying mesh config is experimental or alpha is probably not good enough. Like you kind of have to dig into it a little bit.
Hey, Keith, I saw your hand went up first.
Yeah, so I want to echo something that Ethan said a moment ago, in that it would be very helpful to have owners identified for, or at least a set of owners identified for features that are pre-GA or pre-stable, whatever we call it in Istio, just because it helps to know the trajectory of that feature. It helps to be able to know who to go to if somebody wants to contribute. They know individuals that they can find to help drive that work. So that's point one. The other thing is that, excuse me, I part of me is hesitant to reopen. Maybe it's unavoidable. But part of me is hesitant to reopen the can of worms around what is a feature in Istio, because that is going to require a lot of work and a lot of granularity that might not be immediately useful when there are needs that we have as a community today. And maybe the result of promoting some features is that we have a better idea of what features are. when we go through this process a number of times. So just wanted to call that out. That it can get really deep between, is a feature the API? Is the feature the API as an implementation? Is the feature the API, the control plane implementation, and the data plane implementation? Like there are layers and layers deep that you can go down on this path. I don't know that this group at this size at this time necessarily wants to go through that exercise. And to something I think Ethan said it before, I think there's maybe some lower hanging fruit around existing things that are in limbo. Previously, you've identified telemetry API. I think is a good example, Envoy filter, et cetera, and just getting consensus in mesh config, getting consensus around the future of those things, and executing. So those are some general thoughts. I don't think really go a specific direction, but wanted to call those out.
Thanks, Heath. Mitch, you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's valuable to talk about what maturity levels are for and who the primary beneficiary is of that information. If our goal is to provide value to the TOC, then we could position feature status or feature maturity as simply a way of keeping track of development of features and to prioritize, engineering work as we go through the project. But I think perhaps a more important goal is to communicate clearly to users what level of support they can expect, what level of quality they can expect from a feature. Is this feature, in our estimation, ready for production? That may not provide a ton of value to the technical oversight committee, but I think it would have a tremendous amount of value to our users. It also sets the tone for instance, what is the size of a feature? Mesh config is not really something that users would think of necessarily as a feature. It's more like a configuration interface. But there are going to be other things that they think of as features, and that granularity needs to be appropriate for users to consume it and understand what level of quality they're going to get from the product when they consume it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Ethan?
I agree with that. I just wanted to point out kind of a theme too, is this size of feature point that Mitch makes. In terms of clarifying things, we do have a couple of like giant bucket type features that have massive ranges of that it can allow you to do a bunch of things that are have a very wide range of stability. So mesh config and Envoy filter being the biggest ones. Maybe WASM to some degree. Again, the same theme, like clarifying what actually is and isn't supportable, and breaking those things up into maybe more understandable chunks, so people aren't talking about whether or not mesh config is alpha, right? Would be helpful, but that's kind of a minor point. I think Mitch's broader point is also correct, that the goal is not just being useful to the TOC, but at least from Google's perspective, helping us understand like what we can support because the code is at a sufficient level of quality in upstream is one of the main values that we're hoping to get out of this.
I'd also like to add, Justin, do you have you can go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I'll go after.
I was going to say that I think another thing that we want to keep in mind is like, is this feature even still relevant for the future of Istio? Because I know there are a lot of features who are just sitting there and there isn't any discussion around it. We don't know if it will be eventually deprecated or it's just waiting for someone to work on it further. So getting clarity around like what features we can truly say is a valid feature to use right now.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that, I mean, to beat a dead horse of mine, that I think actually following through and, having like an alpha feature and not that we can stop someone from using an alpha feature, but making it very clear that it is subject to change. Because otherwise the current levels don't actually mean anything because we're just treating them all as stable. So not getting into that situation again, I think is really important. And I know that there's only so much that can be done from this subgroup around that, but I think whatever we can do to encourage this up or out thing so that we don't get back into that situation is important, because we essentially have ended up now with a bunch of features that we consider alpha that are essentially stable at this point because we're not allowed to change them.
Nice. Okay. Any other comments? So far we have clarifying the status of every feature or just features in general in Istio. And we have different ways in which we can go about that, as well as like cleaning up existing features. If we go back to this first point, do we mean like clarifying or actually doing the work to make those features fit a specific stage?
I feel like we probably need input from the TOC about what can be done from this group and what their enthusiasm is to force feature development. And I know in open source you can only force it so much, but what we want to do in terms of if the feature just sort of languishes, if it should be removed or marked deprecated or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we had a lot of discussion around this. I think as we continue discussing, we can come back to like help us get these 3 clear sentences. My next point was around what exactly can be our first deliverables. So a lot of what came up was like actually reviewing features and also deep diving into what are the stages, what are the feature stages, and who are the future stages geared towards, and how we can provide more clarity and awareness around that. So one of the questions around like actively reviewing our features, I'm curious, like how do we go about selecting which feature to review in a given for our first milestone at least? So some things that came to my mind was looking around at like what the graduation to beta momentum is. Like we know right now ambient, there's a lot of activity around graduating ambient to beta, activities starting around telemetry API, and also hopefully as we get going, we can be able to ideally look at some form of a spreadsheet or some dashboard that tells us, hey, this feature is up, it's due for graduation to beta. So I'm thinking that momentum is something we can lean into to see like features. And then of course there's like being aware of what's happening in Istio itself in terms of like what direction Istio is taken. For instance, the changes with ambient or like gateway API and stuff, and seeing how we can like align with that in the features that we select, as well as like our capacity as a subgroup to like drive the review and the graduation that's needed. For instance, I can see subgroup members stepping in to like take feature ownership of something, or simply like shepherding folks around the persons who have been working on a certain feature to like help them have the conversations to get clarity around what is needed here. So that's what I've been thinking in terms of like how do we see like features to review. I don't know if you have any other thoughts in terms of like, okay, this is something we can do over and over when we're getting ready to see like our subset of features. Does anyone have any comments there? if no comments, let's dive into actually applying this, right? So as we figure out what our first milestone is there any features that come top of mind for you all in terms of like, okay, if we have the capacity to do 3 features in the milestone that we're going to do, what will those be and why?
So I don't know if it's totally appropriate for the thing that we're working on, but we're very interested in sorting out a like subset of envoy filter that's supportable. It's probably a little bit hairy. Sorry, to start with. Um, you've already like talked about telemetry API, which is a good starting point. And maybe there's some things we could do around mesh config because it's come up a couple times, but I haven't thought about it enough to speak intelligently yet.
Cool. Yeah. So anyone else has any proposed features in which we can look at? I'm not sure if we can have much impact, what impact we can have with ambient since it's already in motion, but we can throw that on the options as well.
I think it's good to have a selection of existing features that perhaps have stagnated or gotten log jammed and sort of need to get unstuck, as well as forward-looking new features that we can sort of set guidance for. So I wouldn't necessarily exclude ambient. I think we've sort of decided not to take ambient as a feature, but rather as a set of features. And so part of it is hoping to graduate to beta in 120, part of it is not. I do think that there's value that we could add there in terms of, again, guidance on granularity, guidance on how much user feedback is necessary, etc.
I like that. And when you say that we should have a subset of like existing features versus forward looking, do you have any like, I guess, like for instance, percentage, or how do we choose how much effort to put in either direction?
My preference would be to lean into new features over existing, only because existing features are a quagmire. I don't think we can ignore them and provide value. I think they're essential to our success, but they're going to take a lot of work. There's a lot of history there, a lot to untangle, and so I would worry about pulling in too many of those.
Yeah. And I like how the new features already has like a team, curled around it. There's like a bit of momentum there. Justin, do you have an opinion there?
Yeah, I definitely agree that, like, because I tried to do this before and it immediately I got stuck in the quagmire that Mitch was mentioning. On the other hand, I feel like if we don't make some progress towards like a long-term strategy of actually getting all of our APIs correct, it's always going to be confusing to new users about like, whether this alpha API is actually stable or if it's really alpha. And one of the things I almost thought we should just do before is go through, clean up what's there, and then just up, if some of these things we know we're never going to change them because we can't, maybe we should just, get them through the process and get them moved to stable, as opposed to thinking that we're really going to change them in a meaningful way. But like I said, I think going forward, if we don't actually clean up some of this, and I agree we shouldn't 100% do that because we won't make progress. But if we don't have a long-term goal of actually cleaning up all of those APIs, it's going to be very confusing to users.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Justin. I even wonder if it might not be appropriate for us to come up with a particular new category of feature maturity that is like de facto stable, where it
Right.
says, hey, we didn't get this feature as far as we would want to get it, but we recognize that we can't be changing the API at this point. So we're committed not to breaking it, but there are rough edges that we don't love.
Okay.
Cecilia?
Yes, so one thing I wanted to mention here is we need some plan on how to educate new developers as well. Uh, I would say, even considering my own case, I developed a lot of experimental features when I started working in Istio, and I did not know about all these enhancements repository and all these feature stages, and I never really added any of those features to the enhancements repo with their status and all. Only after 3 4 releases I realized all these things, and then I was not so sure what to do about that. So somewhere all these things have to be a bit more clear, or maybe we need to educate when a new person is developing, coming forward to develop a new feature, or what is the commitment expected from them, and then what are the various feature stages and something like that.
Yeah, it sounds like for our first milestone, we have a lot of things to factor in, and we have to decide how much we are willing to take on and what our capacity is. Because I do agree, a lot of effort do need to be put in terms of like um, the clarifying the feature stages, figuring out how enhancements repo fits into that, as well as like actively doing the review process on the subset of features that we select. Is there any
Yeah,
more? Go ahead, sorry.
yeah, I was just going to say to Facila's point, maybe we can update the contributor document to refer to the enhancement process so people are aware of this. One thing I want to share is Envoy filter. I agree with you guys. Want to define a supported subsets of things user can do with Envoy filter, but I also want to say I don't want us to take away from what user can do today from user if they already got it working, right? So if they are confident with their Envoy filter, even though it's understanding it's alpha, I don't want us to take away from them to using those features as long as they understanding that is alpha, not something we're actively promoting. I think that would be good.
Yeah, and I'll just clarify. I agree with that too. I think it's important to have Envoy filter as kind of an escape hatch for advanced users to do whatever they need to do. I think our interest is just really communicating to the user whether or not they're in the danger zone, whether or not they're doing something that's like pretty typical and safe, or whether they really should only be doing whatever they're doing if they're an advanced user. But yeah, I don't think like we should remove Envoy filter or limit it.
Okay, that's great. And we do expect, at least I do expect Waypoint continue to support Envoy filter for the advanced user, right? User knows what they are doing. So as long as, we make it clear, these are the specific subset, we have high confidence you can use it in higher than alpha, whether it's beta or not.
I guess I'm a little, this is probably not the place for this discussion, but I guess I'm a little concerned about blanket support for Envoy filter and waypoints, because that will could make it very difficult to have like managed waypoint proxies later on if it's just considered a supported feature in all use cases.
That sounds like an ambient working group meeting.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
just since it was brought up, I
okay.
just wanted to mention. But yeah, I think it's definitely a conversation that should be had. And this is probably not the group, but just wanted
Yeah,
to.
I agree. Okay, yeah. So that makes sense. Yeah, that's maybe having that as a ambient work group meeting topic in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Sounds good. Thanks.
How many features do you think we can realistically work on in this sprint? And we're not sure how long the sprint is as yet, so I don't know if you have any thoughts around how long the sprint should be too.
Could we also clarify what we mean by like working on a feature in the sprint? Like,
Yeah.
like what's the specific, like what do we want to achieve for a particular feature by the end of the sprint?
I think we will need to like double click into each one of those features and come up with like a definition of done for our subgroup. But when we say working on as a member, it will be either simply evangelizing and I guess creating the momentum around like, hey, this is a feature that we want to have the community work on. And this is either something we will be driving the work on, or we are hoping that folks in the community can pick up the work that needs to happen to make this get to the point that we wanted to get to. So it's a combination of evangelizing and doing the actual work based on your capacity.
I honestly think even just one would be good, because I think the ability for the community to rat hole on a or disagree is pretty impressive. And so so I think not trying not to take on too much, just so that this group can kind of get some experience, understand, like get a success under their belt, and that as well as sort of know kind of what that process is going to be like. I think taking on too much is going to be difficult. And then so maybe just have a single one would be my suggestion, and then maybe next time do 2 or 3 or something like that. But just try and not take like one a really hard one like mesh config or something that's manageable. I think we'll get a lot of experience and be useful.
I agree with that as well. And since we are selecting one, do we want to select one that's forward looking or one that's in the past, like something that is already existing and needs to be cleaned up? My personal vote would be something that needs to be cleaned up, since that will drive a lot of discussion around the feature stages as well as the enhancements repo and those other ugly processes that exist or don't exist.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And for the more forward-looking things, I would say just participate in the existing working group meetings and just make sure that we're not going down previous mistake routes. But yeah, just I would say focusing backwards would probably make sense.
Cool. Does anyone have like a strong opinion on what that first feature should be? I think we have like telemetry API, envoy filter we discussed, and any of the other features that exist.
I feel pretty strongly it shouldn't be envoy filter because that one's complicated.
Yeah.
And so telemetry API might be a good starting point.
Does anyone have any other suggestions or opposition maybe to telemetry API? Okay. I think telemetry API can be a good one as well. I spent the past month really just trying to get the historical context and get an understanding of who actually owns this and what work is needed for it to move forward to beta. So there's some groundwork there, and I did take notes in terms of like what can be improved to make sure we don't ever have to do that again with telemetry API and other features.
Yeah, question. I agree telemetry API is a good candidate, but I assume it's only for sidecar then? Because for ambient, I don't think we have a good story around telemetry yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from the beta scoping that we did, we decided to backlog the ambient telemetry story because it's not clear as yet. So, do you know when that will become clear? Should it be relevant for future review process?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of moving parts, right? There's the metadata service, and then there is also the baggage header. How do we replace it? How do we pass the required headers around? I don't expect us to go to beta right away, so it will probably be experimental first with all these changes.
Is there any active discussion around that?
I don't recall seeing any other than metadata services. I think John and Louis actually signed up to write something, but I haven't seen it.
Okay. That's something we can keep in mind, especially if we start the work in telemetry API and then discussions do like kick up, we can bring some of our subgroup processes and knowledge into those discussions.
Yeah, because I think the main thing is making sure the telemetry API understand, what are the potential impact for ambient, and if we understood it, and then we can see if it still makes sense to promote to beta for sidecar.
Okay. Sounds good.
Do we intend to do anything about all those experimental feature flags which are disabled by default for a long time and nobody really worked on promoting any of them?
Yes, we have to add that to our agenda. Let's see what else is there. So I guess the work that we want to deliver on is telemetry API for feature review. We want to clarify what we want to do in regards to like the different processes and artifacts we have right now, which is like the enhancements repo, as well as like the feature stages, definitions, and so on. Maybe we can deep dive into that right now. For instance, like what work can we do alongside the telemetry API in regards to feature stages? I know within telemetry API, there's some discussion around like some features will not be promoted to beta as well. And there are a couple stuff like providers that we are treating as stable. So I know we can indeed leverage some of the points that we made earlier on and bring that to light as we do the telemetry API work. But does anything stand out to you like clearly? Like, in regards to like how can we use telemetry API to bring more clarity to our feature stages? Or maybe we don't need to and we just focus on tackling feature stages separately. Something that stands out to me is we can focus on either the user or the TOC point of view for like the feature stage of telemetry API. And make sure we include that in our work. Okay. So any thoughts? Anyone has any thoughts right now? How are you feeling on a whole, and like what we discussed today? And what do you think maybe some stuff that we still need to clarify before we can kick off anything around telemetry API and our first milestone? All right. I guess our next question is like, can we find a recurrent time to meet? Does this time generally work for everyone on a Monday? If yes, how frequently do you think we need to meet before we kick off our milestone as well as we sprinting?
This time generally works for me. We do the TOC meeting is at this time, I think once a month. I can't remember the frequency. So I'd say just making sure not to conflict with that, but otherwise kind of having it on an alternate day that we normally have other meetings actually makes my schedule easier, because then makes it more consistent that this time's always unavailable.
Yeah. And the TOC meeting is actually 1 hour before this one starts. So we are good there, I believe.
It's the same time.
It's the same time?
Only, but it's only on second Monday.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I got that confused. I think that's why we had to push the meeting to this week, because it was conflicting with TOC meeting last week.
So I would think if we met I don't know what the right frequency is, but if it were every other week, you could probably time it so it doesn't conflict with TOC.
Yeah, I think a bi-weekly frequency is good for now. And if that's the case, I will set up the meeting to be recurrent. And I hope everyone can continue to let this marinate and think of how are we shaping our first milestone to provide the best value and help us get into a rhythm and a groove as a subgroup. Does anyone else have any last thoughts? If not, I can give you about 3 minutes. Thank you everyone for coming and participating and sharing your opinions.
Thank you for setting this up.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.